January 17, 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The air hung thick with moisture, a living thing that clung to skin and cloth alike. In the pre-dawn darkness, beneath a canopy so dense that even the equatorial stars disappeared, a young American scout named Corporal James Nakamura crouched in silence, his fingers tracing the edge of a vine he had woven days before. The jungle breathed around him, the rhythmic pulse of cicadas, the distant shriek of fruit bats returning to roost, the occasional rustle of something unseen moving through the undergrowth. His uniform, once the standard olive drab of the United States Marine Corps, had become a patchwork of mud and vegetation, indistinguishable from the forest floor itself. Sweat pooled in the hollow of his collarbone. His breath came shallow and controlled. Somewhere beyond the wall of green, a Japanese patrol was moving through terrain they believed they owned, through a landscape they had studied and trained for, through what their officers had promised would be an empire stretching from Manchuria to Australia. They did not know that the jungle had already chosen its side. 300 yards to the north, Lieutenant Masao Fujimoto led 11 men in single file along what appeared to be a game trail. They moved with the confidence of soldiers who had conquered Malaya, who had watched the British flee Singapore, who had seen the fortress of Corregidor fall silent. Fujimoto had been told at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy that the Americans were soft, that they preferred their wars fought from the safety of ships and aircraft, that they would never endure the intimate brutality of jungle warfare. His instructors had shown him photographs of Detroit assembly lines and Hollywood movie sets, evidence of a nation that had grown fat on comfort and spectacle. He had believed them. Every soldier in his patrol had believed them. The vine Nakamura had woven, dismissed by his own platoon sergeant as a waste of time and energy, was about to transform that belief into something else entirely. The history of the Pacific War cannot be understood without understanding this moment, repeated in 1,000 variations across 10,000 miles of jungle and coral. When Japanese forces swept south in the winter of 1941 and the spring of 1942, they carried with them not just rifles and artillery but an ideology forged in the mountains of Manchuria and the rice paddies of central China. They had trained for years in tropical warfare schools, had studied the campaigns of ancient strategists, had convinced themselves that spiritual purity and martial discipline would overcome any material disadvantage. The Americans they expected to face were the Americans of propaganda films. Men who needed hot showers and clean sheets, who complained about rations, who would break at the first taste of real hardship. What Japanese intelligence officers had failed to account for was the peculiar genius of American adaptability, the strange alchemy that occurred when a nation of immigrants, farmers, mechanics, and shopkeepers found itself forced to learn an entirely new kind of war. Nakamura had grown up in California's Central Valley, the son of farmers who had immigrated from Hiroshima 30 years before Pearl Harbor. He had enlisted 3 weeks after December 7th, walking into a recruitment office in Fresno while his parents were being processed for internment. The recruiting sergeant had looked at his face and his name and had almost turned him away until Nakamura had opened his mouth and spoken in the flat, unaccented English of the San Joaquin Valley. Now, 10,000 miles from the orchards where he had learned to prune apricot trees, he was using those same patient hands to construct something the Marine Corps had never taught him, something he had improvised from memory and necessity and a desperate desire to prove that his loyalty was written in something deeper than blood. The trap itself was deceptively simple. Nakamura had spent 4 days observing the patrol routes the Japanese used, noting the times they moved, the way they followed terrain features, the small habits that distinguished veteran soldiers from conscripts. He had noticed that they avoided open ground, that they moved along the base of ridgelines where the undergrowth thinned, that they posted their least experienced soldier at the rear of the column where he was least likely to encounter the enemy. Using this knowledge, Nakamura had constructed a channeling system, not a single trap but a series of subtle redirections that would funnel the patrol toward a killing ground his squad had prepared. He had bent saplings and tied them with vines in patterns that looked natural but created psychological barriers. He had scattered leaves over certain paths and cleared others. He had used the jungle's own architecture to build an invisible maze, and at its center, he had placed something that would have seemed absurd to any textbook tactician. A copy of Life magazine, left partially visible beneath a fallen log. When he had shown the magazine to Sergeant McKinley, a tobacco farmer from North Carolina who had fought in the banana wars of the 1920s. The older man had laughed out loud. "Son," McKinley had said, "you think some Jap is going to stop in the middle of enemy territory to pick up a magazine?" But Nakamura had insisted, had explained in his quiet, methodical way that intelligence reports said Japanese soldiers were desperately curious about America, that they had been told so many contradictory things about their enemy that they couldn't resist evidence. McKinley had shrugged and walked away, muttering about college boys and their theories. Now, as the Japanese patrol approached the channeling zone, that magazine lay waiting like a baited hook. Lieutenant Fujimoto saw it first. The morning light was beginning to filter through the canopy, turning the darkness from black to gray-green, and there in that submarine illumination he caught the edge of something that didn't belong. The bright red logo of Life magazine, impossibly crisp and colorful against the rot and mud of the jungle floor. He raised his fist and the patrol stopped. For 30 seconds, no one moved. Fujimoto's training told him to keep moving, to ignore anything that could be bait, to maintain operational security. But his curiosity, the curiosity of a man who had been told he was fighting subhumans but who had seen the industrial might of Pearl Harbor's wreckage, the curiosity of someone who needed to reconcile propaganda with reality, overcame his training. He signaled to his corporal, a man named Takeda who had worked in a Yokohama print shop before the war, and pointed toward the magazine. Takeda approached cautiously, his rifle raised, scanning the trees for snipers. He knelt beside the log and pulled the magazine free. The cover showed a photograph of an American family at a picnic. A father in shirt sleeves, a mother in a summer dress, 2 children eating sandwiches beside a car that gleamed like it had been forged from sunlight itself. Takeda stared at the image for a long moment, then flipped through the pages. Advertisements for refrigerators and vacuum cleaners and steaks the size of dinner plates. Photographs of factories producing so many airplanes that they were parked in rows stretching to the horizon. An article about a new bomber that could fly higher and farther than anything Japan possessed. He looked up at Fujimoto, and in his eyes was something that might have been doubt, or fear, or the beginning of understanding. The patrol gathered around. They had been in the field for 11 days, eating cold rice and pickled radish, drinking water that tasted of rot, sleeping in holes they dug with their hands. The youngest soldier, a conscript named Yamamoto who had lied about his age to enlist, touched the photograph of the picnic with one muddy finger. He had been told that Americans were starving, that their economy had collapsed, that their cities were filled with bread lines and desperation. The image before him showed something else entirely, a casual abundance so profound it seemed almost obscene. A family eating outdoors for pleasure, not necessity. Food left on plates. A child feeding scraps to a dog that looked healthier than most of the soldiers in Yamamoto's company. They stood there for 90 seconds. In the calculus of jungle warfare, 90 seconds is an eternity. It is enough time for a scout hidden in the canopy to signal his squad. It is enough time for men who have been lying motionless in spider holes to take up firing positions. It is enough time for the jungle itself to rearrange its architecture around the unwary. Nakamura watched through the scope of his Springfield rifle as the Japanese soldiers clustered around the magazine. Their formation dissolved, their attention focused downward instead of outward. He had known they would stop. He had known because he understood something fundamental about human nature, that men who have been fed lies will eventually hunger for truth, even if that truth kills them. The first shot came from Private Wilson, a coal miner from Pennsylvania who could shoot the flame off a candle at 200 yards. The round took Takeda in the temple, and he dropped without a sound, the magazine still clutched in his hands. The second and third shots came simultaneously from opposite sides of the killing ground, a crossfire pattern that the Marine Corps had developed in Nicaragua and perfected in the jungles of Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Fujimoto had time to raise his rifle, time to understand that he had been lured and trapped, time to realize that the Americans he had been taught to despise had outthought and outfought him using nothing but patience and psychology. Then the jungle erupted with muzzle flashes and the wet, punching sound of bullets finding flesh. It was over in less than 20 seconds. 11 Japanese soldiers lay dead in a space no larger than a tennis court, their blood soaking into soil that would grow new trees and ferns and moss, erasing all evidence of the moment within weeks. The Americans emerged from concealment, their faces grim, checking bodies with the mechanical efficiency of men who had learned that mercy was a luxury the jungle did not permit. Nakamura retrieved the magazine, its pages now spattered with blood and mud. He wiped the cover clean and tucked it into his pack, a talisman and a tool and a reminder that wars are fought not just with bullets but with ideas. Sergeant McKinley approached him, his weathered face unreadable. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "I'll be goddamned." He looked at the bodies, then at the elaborate network of bent saplings and cleared paths that had channeled the patrol into the trap. "How'd you know they'd stop?" Nakamura considered the question. "How did you explain to a man from North Carolina that growing up Japanese in America had taught you to see the world through two sets of eyes simultaneously? That he understood what it meant to be told you were one thing while evidence insisted you were another? That the dissonance between propaganda and reality created a hunger that could be weaponized? They needed to know," he finally said. "They needed to know if what they'd been told was true." McKinley spat tobacco juice into the undergrowth. "Well," he said, "they know now." The trap Nakamura had designed would be studied, refined, and replicated across the Pacific Theater. Within 3 months, variations of his psychological channeling technique were being taught at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School on Quantico. Intelligence officers began deliberately planting material, magazines, newspapers, captured letters, photographs, in locations where they knew Japanese patrols would find them, using enemy curiosity as a weapon more effective than many conventional ambushes. The technique had a name in the after-action reports: intellectual bait. But the men who used it called it something else. They called it the propaganda trap, because it turned the lies Japanese soldiers had been told into the mechanism of their own destruction. What Japanese military planners had failed to understand, what their intelligence apparatus could never quite grasp, was that the American military was not a reflection of American society but a transformation of it. The men who fought in the Pacific were not the comfortable citizens of propaganda films. They were Depression survivors who had learned to make something from nothing. They were the sons of immigrants who had crossed oceans and rebuilt their lives in a language they had to learn. They were farmers who understood seasons and patience and the importance of reading landscape. They were mechanics who could see how systems fit together and where they could be made to fail. They brought to warfare a peculiar genius for improvisation, a willingness to discard doctrine when reality demanded it, and a stubborn insistence that problems existed to be solved rather than endured. The Japanese soldier, by contrast, was bound by a military culture that valued obedience over innovation, spiritual purity over practical adaptation. He had been trained in methods that had worked in China, where the enemy was often poorly equipped and demoralized. He had been taught that courage and martial spirit could overcome material disadvantage. He had been told that Americans were weak, that they lacked the spiritual depth to endure suffering, that they would collapse at the first sustained pressure. These beliefs were not mere propaganda but the foundation of Japanese military strategy. When reality contradicted these beliefs, the cognitive dissonance was not just personally devastating but tactically paralyzing. The morning after the ambush, a Japanese search party found the bodies. They were led by Captain Yoshida, a veteran of the China campaigns who had survived the Bataan Death March as one of the overseers. He stood in the clearing where Fujimoto's patrol had died, trying to read the terrain, to understand how 11 experienced soldiers had been killed without firing a shot in return. He saw the bent saplings, but they looked like natural growth. He saw the cleared paths, but they looked like game trails. He found the magazine, still clutched in Takeda's dead hand, its pages now stiff with dried blood. He opened it to a random page and saw an advertisement for a General Electric refrigerator. The advertisement explained that the refrigerator had separate compartments for meat, vegetables, and frozen foods. It mentioned that the freezer could store 60 pounds of food. It showed a woman smiling as she reached inside, her dress clean, her hair styled, her kitchen bright with electric light. Yoshida had been fighting in China when the war began. He had seen the industrial district of Shanghai, had witnessed the capacity of Western technology, had killed civilians who possessed more material wealth than most Japanese officers. But this advertisement suggested something beyond mere industrial capacity. It suggested a society so wealthy that individual families owned machines that could store more food than a Japanese infantry squad carried on a month-long campaign. It suggested a level of abundance that made the entire premise of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere seem like a desperate attempt to acquire what Americans simply took for granted. He closed the magazine and looked at his men. They were watching him, waiting for the explanation that would make sense of this, waiting for the interpretation that would restore the narrative they needed to continue fighting. He had no explanation to give. The documents captured after the war reveal the extent to which encounters like this eroded Japanese military morale. A diary entry from a soldier named Sergeant Nishimura, written 3 weeks after the magazine ambush became known in his regiment, reads, "We were told the Americans were decadent, that they had lost the warrior spirit, that they could not endure hardship. But every day we face new evidence that we were deceived. Their soldiers adapt to jungle conditions better than we do. Their equipment is superior. Their food supplies are inexhaustible. Today our ration was reduced again, half a cup of rice mixed with millet chaff. The smell of American bacon cooking in their camps drifts across the lines at dawn. How can we fight men who eat better in the jungle than we eat at home? How can we defeat an enemy who turns our own tactics against us, who learns faster than we can teach, who seems to possess unlimited resources for every challenge? The officers tell us that spirit will prevail over material, but spirit cannot stop bullets, and spirit does not fill empty bellies." This was the central paradox of the Pacific War. The Japanese military had trained for a conflict against enemies they believed were culturally and spiritually inferior, but they found themselves fighting an opponent who combined material abundance with tactical creativity, who could learn and adapt faster than Japanese doctrine could evolve. The American soldier in the Pacific was not fighting for empire or ideology in the abstract sense. He was fighting to return to a world that, for all its flaws, permitted a level of individual freedom and material comfort that Japanese soldiers could barely imagine. That difference, the difference between fighting to maintain abundance and fighting to acquire it, created an asymmetry that no amount of courage or discipline could overcome. Nakamura's trap succeeded not because it was physically elaborate but because it exploited a fundamental vulnerability in the Japanese military mindset. The soldiers who stopped to examine the magazine were not cowards or fools. They were men who had been fed a narrative that contradicted their lived experience, and they stopped because they needed to reconcile that contradiction. The magazine offered evidence, photographic, undeniable evidence, that the America they had been told about did not exist, and that the real America was something far more formidable than their propaganda had prepared them to face. In stopping to confront that evidence, they made themselves vulnerable. In making themselves vulnerable, they died. And in dying, they became part of a larger pattern that would eventually consume the entire Japanese war effort. The technique spread. By June 1943, American forces across the Pacific were using variations of the psychological trap. On New Guinea, Australian scouts working with American intelligence officers left newspapers describing Allied victories in places where Japanese patrols would find them. On Bougainville, Marine reconnaissance teams planted maps showing the scale of American logistics operations, maps that were technically accurate but selected to emphasize the overwhelming material superiority of Allied forces. On Saipan, Army units staged elaborate fake supply dumps just within view of Japanese observation posts, dumps that suggested resources so vast that resistance seemed futile. The goal was not merely to kill enemy soldiers but to destroy their faith in the narrative that sustained them. The Japanese High Command recognized the threat. In August 1943, the Southern Area Army Headquarters issued a directive warning soldiers not to touch any American materials found in the field. The directive explained that these materials were contaminated with defeatist propaganda, and that examining them constituted a form of spiritual corruption. The directive was largely ignored. Soldiers who were hungry, exhausted, and increasingly aware that they had been lied to could not resist the temptation to glimpse the truth. They picked up the magazines. They read the newspapers. They studied the photographs. And slowly, incrementally, the faith that held the Japanese military together began to fracture. By late 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Japanese units that had been exposed to American propaganda materials, even inadvertently, showed measurably lower combat effectiveness than units that had not. Desertion rates increased. Surrender rates, while still low by Western standards, tripled. Most significantly, the willingness to conduct suicidal banzai charges decreased dramatically. The kamikaze spirit that Japanese officers relied upon required absolute faith in the righteousness and ultimate victory of the cause. Once that faith was compromised, once soldiers began to suspect that they were dying not for a glorious empire but for a lie, the psychological foundation of Japanese tactics collapsed. The symbolism of the magazine, that one blood-stained copy of life that Nakamura had used as bait, became something larger in the mythology of the Pacific War. It represented the weaponization of truth, the idea that in a conflict between a society built on propaganda and a society built on consent, truth itself became an armament. The Japanese soldier had been told he was fighting for civilization against barbarism, for discipline against chaos, for the eternal values of Bushido against the crass materialism of the West. But the magazine showed him something different. It showed him that the enemy he had been taught to despise lived in a world of such casual abundance that families could afford to waste food, that women could afford to smile, that children could afford to be careless. It showed him that he had been sent to die not to defend something precious, but to acquire something his own society could not provide. American abundance became both weapon and symbol throughout the Pacific Campaign. The sea ration that American soldiers complained about contained more calories and higher quality protein than the average Japanese soldier received in a full day's ration. The standard American combat boot lasted for months of jungle warfare, while Japanese soldiers often fought barefoot after their inferior boots disintegrated. The American field hospital could perform surgeries that would have required a major hospital in Japan. The American supply system could deliver hot coffee to frontline positions while Japanese soldiers were chewing on tree bark to suppress their hunger. These were not accidents or coincidences. They were the products of a political and economic system that, for all its flaws, had made the welfare of individual citizens a policy priority rather than an afterthought. Japanese soldiers noticed. They noticed when they overran American positions and found the soldiers had abandoned more food than a Japanese squad carried for a week. They noticed when they captured American supply dumps and discovered crates of materials, insect repellent, toilet paper, cigarettes, candy, that the Japanese military would have considered luxuries. They noticed when American prisoners, even after weeks of captivity, looked healthier than their guards. These observations accumulated, each one a small erosion of faith, each one a reminder that the war they were fighting was not the war they had been promised. The transformation this produced was psychological and profound. The Japanese soldier had been raised in a culture that valued endurance, that found virtue in suffering, that taught that hardship was the path to spiritual refinement. When he encountered an enemy that seemed to fight better precisely because it refused to accept unnecessary suffering, the cognitive dissonance was devastating. How could a soft, materialistic, spiritually corrupt society produce soldiers who adapted faster, fought smarter, and ultimately won? The answer, that democracy and prosperity created a different kind of strength, that free men fighting to preserve their way of life possessed a resilience that conscripts fighting for empire could never match, was too subversive to acknowledge. But it was impossible to entirely ignore. By the time the war reached the Philippines in late 1944, the pattern was undeniable. American forces found Japanese soldiers who had deliberately sought out American materials, who had taught themselves English by reading captured newspapers, who had hidden photographs of American cities in their personal effects. They found diaries that described not just the physical hardships of the campaign but the psychological struggle to maintain faith in a narrative that daily evidence contradicted. One diary, captured on Leyte, contained this entry: "I have seen the enemy's supply depot. The food alone would feed our entire regiment for a month, and they have abandoned it as they retreat. We are told to hold this ground with our lives. But what are we holding? What are we dying for? The officers speak of honor and duty, but I think we are dying because our leaders could not imagine an enemy like this, an enemy that treats its soldiers as valuable and worth preserving. We were taught that American soldiers fight only when victory is certain, but they fight hardest when victory is uncertain, because they believe they have something worth returning to. We fight hardest when death is certain, because we have been taught there is nothing worth returning to but shame. I do not know anymore which is the path of the warrior." This was the ultimate success of Nakamura's trap, replicated across 10,000 miles of jungle and coral. killed enemy soldiers, yes, but more importantly, it killed their faith. It forced them to confront the possibility that everything they had been told was a lie, that the war they were fighting was unwinnable not because of cowardice or failure, but because it had been premised on a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. And once that doubt entered the mind of a Japanese soldier, it could not be extracted. It spread like an infection, whispered in the darkness of foxholes, acknowledged in the glances exchanged between men who no longer believed, but who could not admit their doubt without betraying everything that had given their lives meaning. Nakamura survived the war. He returned to California in 1946, 27 years old, carrying wounds both visible and invisible. His parents had been released from internment, but their farm had been sold, their possessions auctioned, their lives destroyed by the same government he had fought to defend. He did not speak often about the war, did not tell his children about the magazine trap or the 11 men who had died staring at an image of American abundance. But he kept that blood-stained copy of Life magazine, preserved in a plastic sleeve, tucked in a drawer beneath his socks and undershirts. When researchers interviewed him in 1987, preparing a documentary on Japanese-American soldiers in World War II, they asked him why he had kept it. He was silent for a long time, his old hands folded in his lap, his eyes focused on something beyond the camera. Finally, he said, "Because it shows what we were fighting for, even when our own country didn't think we deserved it. We were fighting for the idea that people could live without fear, could waste food if they wanted, could be careless with abundance. That magazine, that stupid magazine with the picnic on the cover, that was worth dying for. Not because it was perfect, but because it was possible." The symbolic weight of that statement cannot be overstated. The Pacific War was fought over resources, territory, and strategic position, but it was ultimately decided by a conflict of ideas. The Japanese Empire promised order, discipline, and spiritual purity, but it delivered hunger, exhaustion, and death. The American system promised freedom, abundance, and individual dignity, and while it did not deliver these things equally or justly to all its citizens, it delivered them sufficiently that its soldiers could fight for years in the worst conditions on earth and still believe they had something worth returning to. That difference, the difference between fighting to maintain hope and fighting to maintain discipline, was as significant as any material advantage. Sergeant McKinley, the North Carolina tobacco farmer who had initially laughed at Nakamura's trap, wrote a letter to his wife in September 1943 that survives in the National Archives. The letter describes the ambush and its aftermath. Near the end, he writes, "I have seen men die in many ways, but I have never seen men die for a magazine before. It makes you think about what we take for granted. These Japs have been told we're weak, that we've got no spirit, that we only care about money and comfort. But what they don't understand is that having money and comfort doesn't make you weak if you know what it took to get them and what it would cost to lose them. A man who's got something worth fighting for will always outlast a man who's been told he's got nothing worth living for." I think that's what this war is really about when you strip away all the strategy and politics. It's about whether human beings do better when they're given hope or when they're given orders. I know which side I'm on. This understanding that the Pacific War was fundamentally a test of two different visions of human organization was not universal among American soldiers, but it was common enough to matter. The men who fought in the jungles of Guadalcanal and Bougainville and New Guinea were not political philosophers, but they understood intuitively that they were fighting to preserve a way of life that, despite its profound injustices, still permitted more freedom and prosperity than the alternative. They could see the evidence in the condition of enemy soldiers, in the desperation of Japanese tactics, in the diaries and letters captured from the dead. They could see that the society that had produced them, with all its flaws, had also produced the food and weapons and medicine that kept them alive. And they could see that the society that had produced their enemies had sent those enemies to die for a lie. The jungle itself became a collaborator in this ideological struggle. Unlike the battlefields of Europe, where industrial warfare predominated and victory often went to whoever could concentrate the most firepower, the Pacific jungle rewarded adaptability, patience, and psychological insight. A single well-placed trap could accomplish more than a battalion assault. A magazine left in the right location could kill more effectively than a machine gun. The environment demanded innovation, and innovation favored the side whose soldiers had been raised to question, experiment, and improvise. The Japanese military, built on obedience and doctrine, struggled to adapt to conditions that changed daily. The American military, built on a culture that valued practical problem-solving over theoretical purity, thrived. This was Nakamura's real genius. He understood that the trap was not the bent saplings or the cleared paths or even the carefully positioned rifle squad. The trap was the contradiction between propaganda and reality, and the bait was the enemy's need to resolve that contradiction. He had taken the most American of objects, a magazine celebrating consumer abundance and middle-class comfort, and transformed it into a weapon more lethal than any instrument of conventional warfare. He had turned the enemy's curiosity into the mechanism of their destruction. And in doing so, he had demonstrated a truth that would echo through the rest of the war, that in a conflict between lies and evidence, evidence will eventually win, but the victory may come too late for those who believe the lies. The epilogue to this story is written in the casualty lists and surrender records of the Pacific War. Between 1943 and 1945, Japanese combat effectiveness declined steadily, not because their soldiers became less brave or less skilled, but because they became less certain. The faith that had sustained them through the early victories, faith in their leadership, faith in their destiny, faith in the narrative that gave their suffering meaning, eroded with each encounter with American abundance, with each captured document describing Allied victories, with each small piece of evidence that suggested they had been sent to die for a lie they had never been permitted to question. By the time the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the surrender they precipitated was less a matter of military necessity than psychological exhaustion. The Japanese soldier had spent 4 years confronting evidence that everything he had been taught was wrong, and in the end, the relief of being permitted to stop believing the lie was almost greater than the shame of defeat. The magazine trap, that absurd little innovation designed by a California farm boy and mocked by a North Carolina sergeant, became a metaphor for the entire Pacific campaign. It showed that wars are not won solely by killing enemy soldiers but by destroying their reasons for fighting. It demonstrated that truth is not neutral but tactical, that in a conflict between propaganda and reality, the side fighting for something real possesses an advantage that no amount of courage or discipline can overcome. And it proved that the greatest weapon any society can give its soldiers is not superior equipment or training but the knowledge that they are fighting to preserve something genuine, something worth the cost, something that makes the horror and sacrifice meaningful. In the end, 11 Japanese soldiers died in a jungle clearing because they needed to know if a photograph was real. They died because the empire that sent them to fight had built their courage on a foundation of lies. And when they glimpsed the truth, they forgot for 90 seconds to be soldiers. Those 90 seconds cost them their lives. But the real tragedy is not that they died, but that they died for a cause that had already been lost. Not in the jungles of Guadalcanal, but in the moment their leaders chose to build an empire on mythology rather than reality. Nakamura's trap did not create that weakness. It merely exposed it, one blood-stained magazine at a time, until the exposure became a pattern, and the pattern became a strategy, and the strategy became the slow, terrible mechanism by which a nation's faith in itself was systematically destroyed. And somewhere in a drawer in California, beneath socks and undershirts, that magazine still waits, its cover preserved behind plastic, its pages still stained with the blood of men who died trying to reconcile what they had been told with what they could see. It waits as evidence that the cruelest weapons are not those that destroy bodies but those that destroy certainty, and that the most American thing about the American victory in the Pacific was not the ships or planes or atomic bombs but the simple, terrible power of abundance to make lies impossible to sustain.